recording this evening's event in hopes that others who weren't able to come can join us. Sorry, there's Larry Lambert, who's just now joined us. Welcome, sir. This is Charlie Garlow speaking. I'm a volunteer with the League of Women Voters of Delaware, and I've been blessed to be the moderator tonight. Welcome everybody to our event. The League is sponsoring this meeting, although there are lots of folks from other good guy organizations out there who are with us tonight. The League of Women Voters, as I'm sure all of you know, is a nonpartisan group interested in good government. And we're hoping to have good government tonight by following our ground rules of this meeting. Not only will the meeting be recorded, but we're going to ask everybody to be on mute during the presentation so that if your dogs bark in the background, it won't interrupt the rest of us. We will have 3 presenters followed by questions and answers. If you have questions you're thinking of, write them down in the chat box rather than thinking to save them until the end because you might forget about them or whatever they were. And then we will go through those questions in the chat box to try to present them to the right person who might be able to best answer the questions. Of course, we're asking everyone to be civil, no bullying or yelling over people or any of that sort of stuff. I don't expect anyone is going to be in that category. Do want to thank our technical crew, Marge Johnson, Tiffany Leiden, and Marianne Coe. Marianne's going to be doing the recording and posting afterwards. Now I'd like to call on our terrific chairperson of the Advocacy Corps, Linda Barnett, to give us a few words of welcome from the League. Linda?
Thank you, Charlie. And I am pleased to echo the words of Charlie, welcoming everybody on behalf of the League. As chairperson of our Advocacy Corps, I am very proud of the work we do, and one of which is offering wonderful programs like this. Our Advocacy Corps monitors the work of our General Assembly and looks for bills that are in line with our policy positions and works hard to try to get those bills passed. But tonight we're celebrating the work of our program organizers in presenting this wonderful program on an extremely critical subject. And because it is so critical and so significant, I won't waste any more time. I'll turn it over to Peggy, one of our wonderful Advocacy Corps members, who can get this meeting started.
Thanks, Linda. And thanks for steering us in the right direction as chair of the Advocacy Corps. You do a great job. I'm Peggy, and I'm chair of the Climate Change and Energy Committee of the League of Women Voters of Delaware, the portfolio chair of that group. And I'm happy to introduce our 3 great speakers today. They're going to speak in sequence with no questions in between. We'll have questions at the end. And we have, first of all, James Fletcher, a board certified family medicine physician in Delaware, in Dover actually, and a member of the Medical Society Environmental Health and Diversity Committee. We're terribly happy to have him here today. He was recommended by about 4 people, so we didn't know him before this event came up, but we're happy to meet him now and to have him so heartily recommended. Mary Douglas will speak next. She's an environmental lawyer who worked in Washington, D.C. at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, and she's also had experience with the Clean Air Act. She is now a resident of Rehoboth Beach, and we're very happy to have her helping us out tonight. Dustin Thompson is the advocacy and outreach organizer with the Delaware Sierra Club and a relentless advocate for renewable energy. So let's begin with Dr. Jim.
All right, I'll share my screen if I can. Make sure you can see everything. Okay, Let's see, share. Well, if I can get the screen to share, then we'll be very successful. Yeah. Trying to grant access. Peggy, you wouldn't happen to have my slides as a backup, would you?
Yes, I do, actually. Maybe Tiffany, you have them, don't you?
I do not, but if you're able to send them to me, Peggy, I can.
Uh-huh.
Or Peggy can share them if she can do that.
Let's see. Sorry, guys.
Brief technical difficulty.
Those of us who are not so gifted are sort of happy to see a few of you who are gifted fumbling around, quite frankly. And now I will mute myself again.
Oh dear, let's see. Sorry, guys, I'm to be so slow. Uh, I can. Just about there. While I'm doing this, I'd like to, Charlie, why don't you give a special welcome to Representative Lambert while I'm struggling to get this going here.
Yes, I was thinking of doing that very thing to fill the void by welcoming Representative Larry Lambert, a longtime supporter of lots of good things, including the environment. Would you like to say a few words, Larry?
Good evening, everyone. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for the warm invite. I appreciate everything that you all do. I just got in from Dover. There's a lot of things going on down there, and I'm happy to be here. I'm always willing to learn, and I really want to thank all of the League of Women Voters and everyone viewing at home for the outstanding work you do. Thanks.
Well, we're glad to have you with us this evening. How are we doing on this slideshow?
Did you
Are you
receive,
going to?
Tiffany, did you receive my message? Good. So we're on the way.
Hooray.
I guess this was the only piece I didn't practice, was sharing my screen.
Well, we can see your slides now, Dr. Fletcher.
Oh, perfect. Is it on my screen?
It's
Or-
on my screen and I think
Oh.
everyone else's.
Perfect. And let me see if I can advance to the second. Were you able to see that second slide?
You're probably going to have to tell Tiffany when you want her to progress.
Oh, I prepared for that. I have a cue for next slide. All right. Thank you for everyone's patience. And to start, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would first like to thank the League of Women Voters for the invitation, to Peggy Schultz, not only for her patience, but her assistance with my slide deck, and Anna Kissel with sourcing some of the material to make sure everything that I share today can be verified from original source material. My name is James Fletcher, a family physician based in Kenton, Sussex, Delaware. It's important to note that although I was raised here in Dover, Delaware, I was born in Baltimore, Maryland. And before moving to Delaware at the age of 11, it was believed I had pediatric asthma, or reactive airway disease. As a young soccer player in the Catholic leagues, playing for the St. Francis of Assisi team, I was never too far without my trusty handheld albuterol inhaler. Imagine my parents' surprise when, on my first summer and first soccer season in Delaware, my need for my inhaler vanished. Have I been cured? Or was there something to leaving an urban city environment where I lived on a main commuter thoroughfare through the city to a quiet cul-de-sac in a rural setting. Was my zip code my medical destiny? For many in the US and here in Delaware, where you live does determine what schools are in your district, what grocery stores are nearby. It determines your public safety net, how close a fire station or police station is. It also determines what pollutants are in your environment. Let me go to the second slide, please. In terms of the African-American population at large, we are 75% more likely to live in what's called a fence line or an adjacent community to an industrial facility. When that industrial facility is an oil and gas production facility, asthma, cancer, COPD, and cardiovascular risks and rates go up. To put a fine point on it, asthma rates in the African-American community are nearly double that of our white counterparts when we apparently have more access to poor air quality, and that's 13 to 7% in the US population. So how does one change this destiny, and how does this particular asthma outcome change a young child of African-American descent, say with asthma? Well, in terms of the death rate, there's a 10-fold difference compared to our white counterpart, whereas 1 in 1 million versus 10 in 1 million are at risk for death every year. So in a country of 300 million people, that's 300 lives to 30. If we can advance to the next slide, this point, if we periscope out, helps illustrate the intersection where environmental and social justice come together. But we today are declaring a climate emergency because these fence line communities are effectively the canary in the coal mine for what is on the horizon to affect all of us US citizens. Would you believe that a quarter of all cardiovascular, pulmonary, and cancer-based disease burden can be reduced to a single isolate in the air? 2.5 micrometer particulate matter is that isolate. If you had a few hours, we could do a deep dive into all the long-term effects of 2.5 micrometer particulate matter, everywhere from enhancing the risks of Alzheimer's to type 2 diabetes, from the risks of underdeveloped lungs leading to an underweight at birth child, to increased rates of reactive airway disease, asthma to COPD, to the cardiovascular disease, to lung cancer and a variety of other cancers. To get a sense of scale, if we can go to the next slide, you're able to see that a human hair is about 70 micrometers in diameter, and a grain of sand, 90 micrometers. An N95 mask can prevent inhalation of 0.3 micrometer particulate matter. So if we were to just wear our N95, perhaps we could put this problem to bed. But if we are not with a mask and we were to be inundated with this particulate matter, well, our bodies will go through changes. In fact, inflammatory changes in our alveoli in our lungs and in the vasculature in our blood vessels. An inflammatory process will take place, increasing our work of breathing, engaging repair mechanisms that in our vasculature would be better off maintaining function instead of fighting off a foreign invader. But our bodies are very adaptable. But I like to use a metaphor here in terms of our systems and whether we want them to be making these business decisions. I find it very easy to pick apples in an orchard on a sunny day. It becomes far more difficult when half of that orchard is on fire. So let's talk about bad air days. In 2020, Shanghai, China, boasted its best air year in terms of 2.5 particulate matter. 32% of the days that year, they were under the World Health Organization target of 10 micrometers per squared meter. That's what we consider a tolerable amount for the average human being to make it through. Well, what about the other 68% of those days where the average 2.5 particulate matter level was between 30 and 40 micrograms per squared meter? Imagine wearing an N95 when we're outside 7 months of the year. It's that dystopian glimpse of our own future if we don't make some important course correction that we could see here, even in Delaware, as we move to the next slide, in terms of O3 ozone, and I'll dive back into the 2.5 particulate matter. But first, an aside on ozone. What is ozone? Many in the climate space may remember many moons ago when it was talked about the disintegrating ozone layer and its protection against our UV lights from the sun. But believe it or not, ozone, as a much more attractive name, we call smog on the ground level. It's the product of a pretty neat reaction with the exhaust byproducts of motor vehicles, industrial facilities, power and gas stations, with a little bit of sunlight. So if you were to ever look on a hazy summer day, say in the Bay Area of California, you're able to see that reaction in real time. And you can imagine that's not the most ideal scenario to be breathing some of that air. In fact, in Newcastle in 2019, only 3 days of exceeding the EPA's standard for ozone gave Newcastle an F for the year in terms of excess ozone. If we were to compare it to our downstate cousins county-wise, well, Kent and Sussex earned a C grade if we go to the next slide. But when it comes to the actual 2.5 particulate matter, we get A's in Kent and Sussex, but we do get a C grade still in Newcastle. And why is that? And if we were to look at Delaware City or some of the industry and businesses in that most northern county, we're able to see they're inundated population-wise with a little bit more gaseous byproduct of that ground level ozone and a little bit more of the byproduct of the 2.5 particulate matter. So when I think of a young Dr. Fletcher who had just moved to Dover, 1995, if I'd only moved 40 miles further north, I still may not know what it's like to run outside without an inhaler. So let's review and advance to the next slide. The social determinants that facilitate wealth accumulation, such as access to real estate, credit markets, employment opportunities, that do translate directly into our access to healthcare, access to healthy groceries, quality schools, proximity to industrial facilities, traffic, can determine our access to quality air. For our last few slides, I'd like to expand on the idea of air pollution as a motivator to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels as an energy source, because a cynic may say, if we just scale up our distribution of N95s to a ubiquitous level, if we were to upgrade our air filtration in our homes and businesses and schools, well, we could plausibly kick this air pollution can down the road. But what happens when the climate actually leads to warming? Let's just say a 2 degrees centigrade increase or 3.6 degrees Fahrenheit. Are there disparities that are also borne out in the data? I do believe that the zip codes do continue to matter. We advance to the next slide. We're able to see that African Americans are 40% more likely than their other ethnic groups to live in an area that's high for climate-driven extreme temperature-related deaths. That sentence is a mouthful. And at 4 degrees centigrade, African Americans are now at 60% more likely, and their Hispanic brethren have now been increased to 43% risk of climate-driven extreme temperature-related deaths. If we think of our Native American population, they are also living in regions where their labor hours are lost to extreme temperatures. This gets me thinking downstate to the migrant communities here in Delaware, where their workplace is actually outside in the elements. Access to the type of job, to where you live, does seem to determine your health destiny. We move to the next slide. If we just look to a scatter plot on the temperature rise of Delaware since the year 1900, we've gone up over that century about 3 degrees centigrade, 10.8 degrees Fahrenheit. If we were to curb our emissions as a state and ideally as a country, by 2100, we may only see a modest 1 degree increase in temperature. But if we don't change anything, or at worst, accelerate our combustion rate of carbon, we may face if you look at the higher projections in the red there, a 10 to 12 degrees centigrade increase as forecast. And this is 2022 data by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, also known as NOAA. As a state, we do have some hope. We have recently committed to diversify our energy portfolio to 40% renewables by 2035. And there's some consideration of wind farms off the coast. More negotiations need to be done. But I say with that as a benchmark, I think we can do even better as a state. We are a coastal state, as we move to the next slide. When I moved here in 1995, we didn't have a basement in Dover because we were aware of the low water table. In researching for today's talk, imagine my surprise when I found that 41% of African-American communities at large in the United States are living in areas with the highest rate of traffic delays for just high tidal flooding. If anyone's driven through Dover on a regular commute during the summer, you may know this to be true, where you may lose a couple of hours trying to make it through when the rivers do burst and the creek does rise. If you have the most robust access to poor air, heat and flood vulnerable employment and housing, perhaps you'll have more resilience to a disaster, loss of shelter, wealth, and transportation. Well, unfortunately, in the data, we found this to be untrue, as the resilience it takes to build back better often requires resources. As we advance to the next slide. August of last year, many moons ago, if we remember, Hurricane Ida displaced several frontline communities, even here in Wilmington, Delaware. Well, about 5 to 6 months later, as of January 2022, in a really great article in the News Journal, we followed about 30 of those fellow Delawareans who were displaced just in August, and they're still living in shelters or in their cars, and many had to uproot and leave the area entirely because when you wake up one day and your home is gone, with the best insurance company and the most aggressive federal response, you may be made whole in that 12 to 24 month interval. But without a well of resources to draw upon, how will you secure shelter, food, clothing, and transportation for just the next night? The next 30 nights? How long until you've spent through your reservoir of savings? So while my esteemed colleagues approach the climate emergency from an avenue of different directions, go to the next slide, I'd like you to think about your zip code. Should those 5 digits determine your health destiny? If we are intentional with our policy and the ways we promote equality and equity, the only address that should matter is galaxy Milky Way, planet Earth. Thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful, Dr. Fletcher. That was just very stimulating and gave us lots to think about. Let's go to Mary Douglas now.
Let me unmute and share my screen now. Here we go. Okay. I have to say first to Dr. Fletcher, that was wonderful. And it had so much resonance for me. I grew up in Pasadena, California in the 50s and 60s, where sometimes the housewives would wear gas masks left over from World War II when they hung out their clothes. And I too had an albuterol inhaler, although it was a different side of the country in a different situation. So a climate emergency. My overview for my talk here, why declare a climate emergency? What is the purpose of that? And the global response I'll talk about for a few minutes to global warming. And then Delaware, as Dr. Fletcher pointed out, it's hotter and more vulnerable than other states. So far, 2,089 jurisdictions have declared a climate emergency, and that includes a lot of US cities and many European countries, South Korea, Canada. Even Pope Francis asked quite a few of the heads of oil companies to the Vatican to urge them to reduce burning fossil fuels. In spring of 2021, Hawaii became the first state in the United States to declare a climate emergency. And I'm working with a number of environmental groups to make Delaware, that is the first state, become the second state to declare an emergency. But a declaration of emergency would be hollow without actions to ameliorate the emergency. So Dustin will be talking about the really practical legislative package that we're attempting to get through our Delaware legislature to reduce greenhouse gas emissions effectively sooner. This is, for me, it's a little bit cut off here, but I hope you can see it all. This shows CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels, which trap heat and reflect it back to the earth. I mean, that's essentially what's been happening since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution in 1850 or so. And we have atmospheric concentrations of CO2 that have increased 40%, and rising levels of CO2 emissions. You can see that they kind of go along in a fairly low curve. This is million metric tons of CO2 over on the left. And then after World War II, when there was great development in the United States and worldwide, they shoot way up. And these are the temperatures that follow the CO2 emissions in our atmosphere. They're also shooting up. And we have now like 1 degree increase centigrade and a little bit more Fahrenheit. I don't know if I can get rid of the little people, including myself, on the right. Then I could see my own slides better. Just a minute, I'm sorry. Well, that's okay. Here are the top CO2 emitting countries, 1750 to 2020, and we led the way with 24.5%. And China was next, Russia, Germany, the UK, Japan. But then you'll see a contrast where in the next chart, China is now emitting 29%. This is 2019, more recently. And we have fallen off somewhat. We're doing better with renewables, and we've traded in a lot of our coal burning power plants for natural gas, which helps. Not enough, I would argue, definitely, but it helps somewhat. So at any rate, the proportion of our emissions has dropped somewhat compared to China, which is trying very hard to electrify a vast country. And at one point, about 2 decades ago, it was building 1 coal-fired power plant every 2 weeks, which is rather astounding. But to be fair to China, they're doing well with things like green building codes, and they're doing well with electrifying their vehicle fleet. The international response to global warming. There have been many international meetings, conferences of the parties, or COPs, have been held annually since Kyoto in 1997 to limit global warming emissions. And the most significant of the COPs was in 2016, the Paris Climate Accords. we kind of, as the United States, we were in under President Obama, abruptly out under President Trump 4 years later. Now we're in those Paris Climate Accords again. And the draft climate bill that we've submitted to the Delaware legislature states, whereas in April 2016, world leaders recognized the urgent need to curb climate change by signing the Paris Climate Accords, agreeing with the recommendations of the International Panel on Climate Change to make efforts to limit the global temperature increase to 1.5 degrees centigrade. That's kind of the watchword among all national and international environmental groups, is that has to be the limit, or we lose a lot of the planet as we know it. In terms of biodiversity, in terms of climate predictability, in many, many ways. So that's the benchmark. The latest UN IPCC report was released just a few weeks ago in April, and the language was more strident, more urgent than ever. The IPCC co-chair said it's now or never if we want to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade without immediate and drastic emissions reductions all across all sectors of all of our economies, it will be impossible. You know, just as a footnote to all this, in the Glasgow COP, Greta Thunberg and the young people who follow her amazing example of energy and dedication were marching through the streets of Glasgow at, I think it was the 26th COP, Conference of the Parties, and they were saying, no more blah, blah, blah. And that got a lot of the dignitaries who were attending the COP, that got their attention. And truly, she has been great at trying to get action and not words. So atmospheric CO2, atmospheric CO2 concentrations come mainly from the energy and transportation sectors. That's pretty much worldwide, but it's certainly true in the United States. And fossil fuels, oil and natural gas, supply most of our energy needs, including 60% of our US electricity generation. And I was listening carefully to Dr. Fletcher because, you know, when I grew up in California, you know, cars are king. We drive everywhere, and we couldn't wait at that time to get our licenses when we were 16, but all cars that are internal combustion engine and not running on electric, they're essentially mini factories that release tailpipe emissions, CO2, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds, which are composed of carcinogenic substances like toluene, acetane, benzene. And I was also interested in the association with leukemia now, which is becoming a little more clear. Was always mysterious for a while, but you know, there were a lot of people in Southern California who were suffering from cancers that were probably related to those tailpipe emissions. An overheated planet has dangerous impacts. And here we have the four horsemen of the apocalypse: flood, drought, wildfires, hurricanes. We know, we see this all the time, that they're increasing. Scientists have documented that global warming has caused increased risk of all of these cataclysmic events. And just by way of explanation, we've always had extreme weather events, but now global warming has essentially increased the chances of frequent weather extremes. And James Hansen, a noted climatologist, analogizes the chances of extreme weather events to loaded dice. A six-sided die now has four sides that have red dots, or extreme weather conditions, one green dot for average weather and one blue dot for cool. So the probability of you throwing that die and red showing up is 66% anytime you throw it, just as in any given year, there's a 66% chance increase that there'll be drought, hurricane, flooding, or fire. So you can still have what we call normal years, normal weather. You still see politicians with snowballs standing there saying, I've heard about global warming, but it doesn't look like it to me. And this is really the answer. It's a matter of probability. Delaware is warming faster than most states. According to EPA, Delaware has warmed between 2 and 3 degrees Fahrenheit in the last century, more than most of the nation. In the last 5 years, there's been a very steep warming curve, and NOAA, that's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, has concluded that Delaware's warming has accelerated, along with Connecticut, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, because of its proximity to the warming waters of the Atlantic. Causes of sea level rise in Delaware. About half of sea level rise is caused by melting of sea ice and glaciers in the Arctic, and that's worldwide. The other half, also worldwide, is caused by ocean expansion due to global warming, which changes the density of the ocean, it expands it. The Mid-Atlantic is a sea level rise hotspot, according to a 2021 DENRAC report. That's our Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Controls. So the seas are rising in Delaware more rapidly than other parts of the country. And not only coastally, but areas near tidal rivers, the Christina, the Brockhill, the Indian, the Delaware, are at risk, and nearby lands are at risk of flooding. DENRAC estimates up to 5 feet of sea level rise could occur by 2100. Delaware has the lowest mean elevation of any state in the country. We all know low and slow. It's 60 feet above sea level. And in Delaware, land is subsiding. This was definitely new to me. I never knew this before. I looked into it a little, but Delaware is subsiding as a tectonic plate that once covered much of the northern northeast is gradually rising. And so like a seesaw, when the land rises in Pennsylvania, it slowly causes neighboring Delaware to sink, increasing the impact of sea level rise. So here we have the Brandywine River in Wilmington near Market Street Bridge. September 2nd, just last year, Hurricane Ida, just the impacts were terrible. And how sad that people are still living in trailers after that, how really awful. And this is the Lewis Canal, which overflowed in a winter storm in 2015. I live in Lewis. We took our children to Rehoboth just about every year for about 25 years, Peggy, but I do live in Lewis now with my husband and dog. And here's Dewey Beach. I think it's 2014. Pretty much of a lake. Brockhill Beach after Hurricane Sandy. Now this is a wonderful website, the coast.noaa.gov SLR, sea level rise. And if you go to that, you can hone in on your neighborhood and even your house, and then key in different timeframes to see how sea level rise will affect your particular neighborhood and house. So this is Wilmington area, the current mean high water. And this is in 2100 after 5 feet sea level rise potentially occurring. So I'll go back before. This is New Jersey over on one side. And this is the Delaware River. This is Wilmington. And this is after sea level rise. A lot has been flooded. This is my area, and this is our beloved Henlopen State Park, and Lewis Beach and Brockhill Beach. That's now, and quite a lot of it is flooded if we let it occur. in 2100. Now, this is interesting. I came across this. It's called Construction Coverage, Expert Reviews and Guides. The state's building the most new homes in high-risk areas. And it's us, Delaware, and I think it's pretty much the southern counties, but certainly all around me in Sussex County, there's a tremendous amount of building going on. So Delaware, New Jersey, and Rhode Island, the state's building the most new homes in high-risk areas. So this is our whereas that sort of sums everything up. And I'm having a little trouble reading it because of the little, maybe I can eliminate these little people, including myself. There. Delaware has the lowest mean elevation of all states in the United States, and with its 381 miles of ocean, estuarine, and riverine coastline, is exposed to sea level rise of between 2 and 5 feet by 2100, and loss of up to 11% of its land mass by the end of the century, resulting in damage to tens of thousands of homes and businesses, erosion of ocean beaches that drive the state's tourism economy, inundation of the Port of Wilmington and other industrial facilities along the Delaware River. And a word at the end about human health impacts of climate change. Delaware ranks 5th in having the greatest percentage of people aged 65 and over, according to the recent census results. And that age cohort is more vulnerable to extreme heat in the summer and more at risk for heat stroke. And here is a footnote on vector-borne diseases. There is a wonderful resource in our DENREC, Dr. William Meredith, who has a PowerPoint about mosquitoes. Unless prompt and effective emissions reductions are undertaken, Delaware's mosquito season is likely to increase to 7 months, April to November, from the current 5, May to October, and increasingly warm and wet conditions are likely to expose Delaware residents to a greater risk of contracting West Nile virus, dengue fever, yellow fever, and Zika. But we can tackle our climate emergency. We do have the technical tools, and it's been fascinating just in the last decade to see a change in tone and a change in outlook. We have battery storage capability for wind and solar that we didn't have just in the recent past. And I think, with political will, we could make some big changes fast. So our last whereas is whereas Delaware, and this again is part of our legislative package that went to our Delaware State Legislature. Delaware stands ready to substantially grow its economy and attain social and health benefits by mobilizing resources and labor to combat climate change and commit to statewide action that is rooted in equity, self-determination, culture, tradition, and the belief that locally and around the world, people have the right to clean, healthy, adequate air, water, land, food, education, and shelter. And for purposes of this presentation, we want our land. We don't want to lose 11% of it to sea level rise. We want our shelters. We don't want them submerged under flooding. So, and that's the end.
Thank you, Mary. Peggy, do you want to welcome our third speaker? Maybe Peggy's having some difficulty. Our third speaker is Dustin Thompson from the Delaware Sierra Club. Dustin, do you want to introduce yourself some more and proceed?
Yeah, happy to. I think maybe Mary has
Oh,
to.
here, I'm sorry, Dustin, there.
All right, great. So let me share my screen here. All right, is that, can you see the full screen now? All right.
Yes.
All right, well, thank you very much for inviting me to speak this evening, and thanks to everybody that's been helping out on this initiative. It's certainly a very big group effort. So we've heard a lot about kind of why we should declare a climate emergency. So I've been invited to talk a little bit about what that would look like and what Delaware can do about the emergency situation that we're in. So I'm going to speak about what exactly a climate emergency is in terms of a declaration. Also going to talk about greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Going to introduce folks, I think, by and large, to the idea of a climate directive, and talk about the need for a lot of planning and reporting. So I'd like to talk about what a climate emergency is by actually starting with what it's not. So when folks hear climate emergency or the word emergency in general, and declaring some type of emergency, they often think about what we've just been through for the past couple of years with COVID, which was a public health emergency. Or they'll think about what happens when a natural disaster occurs, which is generally a state of emergency. And what these do is they give powers to individuals in the government that they wouldn't ordinarily have. And so policing powers, power to make policy changes, in whether they're short-term or long-term. A climate emergency declaration doesn't do that. That's the real key kind of takeaway. And it's important to state that and be very clear about that. It doesn't give folks powers that they wouldn't ordinarily already have. But it's still really important because it's a recognition of our current situation. If we don't define the problem, if we don't say it outright, the situation that we're in, how can we hope to combat that situation, to solve these problems? And so it really sets the stage, the floor to action, to change from the inaction that we've had for a long time, or tampering and tinkering around the edges, to committing to real change, to taking real action. And so that's why declaring a climate emergency is so important, because if we don't recognize our situation, we don't really have a hope of getting out of it. So I'm sure everybody on the call here has heard of greenhouse gases, and some folks have probably heard about greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So when we talk about greenhouse gases and greenhouse gas emission reduction goals, we're specifically talking about a few types of emissions. Most people, when they hear greenhouse gases, they think about methane and carbon dioxide or carbon in general. But there are others as well. So you also have nitrous oxide is a pretty powerful greenhouse gas, as well as fluorinated gases. A lot of you may remember the talk around HFCs or hydrofluorocarbons. A lot of talk around what refrigerants to use and not use. And that's because these fluorinated gases have a extraordinarily high global warming potential. And so there are emissions beyond just carbon and methane, both of which are obviously very important, that we also have to curb. But what we don't talk about when we're talking about greenhouse gas emissions and by proxy emission reductions is things like particulate matter. But it's important to know and to note that as we reduce greenhouse gases through cleaning industrial processes, switching away from fossil fuels, electrifying transit, electrifying our homes, you get also a reduction in those co-pollutants, other types of oxides, small particulate matter. You see in states that are meeting these goals or working towards these goals, you're seeing these other pollutants also be reduced. But there are other policies to specifically target those pollutants and reduce those, particularly in overburdened communities. So we set goals, right? But how do we get to them? Generally, it's a mix of administrative actions and policy decisions. So legislation and executive action or administrative actions. And so you'll see restrictions on permitting allowances on the administrative side, or joining the ZEV mandate that our state just did, zero emission vehicle mandate. Again, administrative action. And then you see things like we did the RPS increase, where we're committing to going more renewable energy, and that's a policy change. And there's many more policy changes that can be made to help us meet these goals. So Delaware is actually one of 24 states that has some sort of greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. Now ours, though, is executive. And so Governor Markell started the process. Governor Carney joined the US Climate Alliance when Trump pulled us out of the Paris Accords. But Governor Carney committed to the first round of the US Climate Alliance. They have since moved on, and we have not. So we are still back on with 26% by 2025, emission reductions over 2005 levels. The other states have moved on in line with what Biden is suggesting we have to do, which is 50% by 2030. We have not done that. And so executive action is not the way to go. The next governor could come in and say, you know what, I'm not even doing that. I'm not even doing the 26% or by 2025. I don't think climate change is real. And he can just, wipe that progress away. And so executive action, a number of states have done that. Delaware has done that. It's not the way to do it. You need to do it through legislative. You need to codify your goals in the Delaware code to make sure that they stand the test of time and that they have the teeth they need to get us to where we need to be. And so usually these goals are done in increments. And so you'll see a lot of the states around us and other parts of the country, usually somewhere between 5 and 10 years. And so maybe they have a 2030 and then a 2035, 2040. And then oftentimes what you'll see is a big jump to 2050. And so you'll see, 5-year increments and then a 10-year increment from 40 to 50. That's not always the case, but it is pretty common to see a long-term goal. And more recently, that long-term goal is net zero emissions by 2050. That's generally the long-term goal. So what should our goals be? Well, as I said, right now, we have a pretty soft goal that if we do nothing different, we're going to get to it anyway. That was in the climate action plan. We'll get to that 26% by 2025. We don't have to do anything. So problem solved, right? We don't need any legislation. We're good to go. Well, we should probably go beyond that. And so if you look into the climate action plan, they did a lot of modeling, a lot of different scenarios, said, what if we did this? What if we did that? And they really looked and honed in on 20 key actions. And that was things from reducing transportation emissions, better land use policies, looking at expanding even further our renewable portfolio standard, or just requiring renewable energy. There was a number of different actions that they said, okay, what if we did some of these versus all of these? And they said, okay, if we did all 20 of these actions, and I should note there was actually more than 20, but they didn't have the resources to model all of them. We're hoping to get more information on what those ones that were left out were from the folks that did that. But let's say we did all 20 of these actions that we came up with. None of them were extraordinarily creative or outside of the box. They're all kind of within the realm of what we're currently doing and expect to do. We would get to 31% by 2025 and 41% by 2035. Well, that's not really where we need to be in terms of climate science. And we know that President Biden has embraced the climate scientists with the IPCC, and he said, no, we need 50% by 2030 and net zero no later than 2050. So not at 2050, but no later than 2050. And so I should also mention that in the climate action plan modeling, this is really important. So they made a lot of assumptions with that. And a number of assumptions with that modeling was President Trump was in office, right? We weren't going to get the infrastructure bill because this was all done when Trump was in office. So no infrastructure bill, no ZEV, no federal assistance of any kind, right? And in fact, we assumed, or they assumed when doing this modeling, that the rollbacks that Trump was doing was going to continue happening. And so when we look at those goals in the climate action plan, it's important to note that these things are not the case anymore. We do have the infrastructure money. We do have President Biden. We do have these rollbacks that Trump did getting reversed and in fact moving further ahead. And so we can meet further and more ambitious goals, even with just those 20 actions, which of course we need to do more than just 20 actions, right? So our proposed goals in this legislation are in line with what Biden has suggested, what climate science is telling us we need to do, and with what the more ambitious states are looking at doing. And in fact, Maryland just passed legislation that went even further than the most ambitious states, right? So our neighbor right across the state line there. So 50% by 2030, 70% by 2040, 90% by 2045, and net zero by 2050. Now, just with a small caveat on the net zero, the worst thing that we can do is get to net zero and then have some emergent technology, like, you know, maybe some actually manage to figure out carbon capture or what have you. And then we take that technology and use it as a way to slide backwards into emitting these pollutants. Because just because you eliminate the greenhouse gas and the carbon does not mean you eliminate those co-pollutants, right? So we don't want to slide backwards and cause health issues and other catastrophic things that are happening right now in our communities. And so what we did was said that at 2050, you can't go any further back than 95% emission reductions. And so it doesn't matter what your technology is, your emissions still can't go backwards past 95%. So there's a backstop to make sure that even when we hit net zero, that we don't start working our way backwards. So a lot of folks have heard of greenhouse gas goals, emission reductions, but what I'm finding out is that not a lot of people have heard the term climate directive. And so I do want to kind of define that. So what we have right now is a huge problem in our state agencies, and that a number of them are expressly forbidden to consider climate change. They're not allowed, they have to throw up blinders. They're not allowed to look at the science of climate change. They're not allowed to look at our greenhouse gas goals, the ones that we even do have. They can't consider these things when they're making their decisions. We've heard this directly from the Public Service Commission chair that, hey, I'd love to consider climate change when I look at expanding natural gas lines, but I'm not allowed. So if you want me to do it, you got to change the code. Well, that's what we're going to do. We're going to expressly state that all state agencies and public bodies have to consider our greenhouse gas goals, and they have to consider the impacts of their decisions on climate change. And so with that, in one fell swoop, we can make sure that the PSC, the public advocate, DENREC, everybody, DELDOT, when they're considering new projects, new permits, new regulations, they are also considering what those will have in terms of impact on our climate future and on our greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. So that's a climate directive. Planning and reporting in all of this is absolutely the key, because if we set goals but we don't have a plan to get there, then the goals are meaningless. And it can't just be, oh, we're gonna figure it out when we get there. No. We need a roadmap to get to each goal. And so in other states, their DENREC equivalent essentially comes up with that roadmap. It's a macro plan, right? You have micro plans that are really detailed, and then you have macro plans that have sweeping changes, that have big picture items, that have the things that that DENREC from the outside of state agencies are going to see that obviously we need to change these things. And so they are being tasked with creating these roadmaps, these macro plans for each goal. And while they're developing those goals, not after, it's really important, not after, while they are developing these plans, that they are working with vulnerable communities that are being impacted already by climate change, and with the other state agencies that are going to be on the hook for making these changes. And to make sure, one, for the vulnerable communities, that they're getting not only harm reduction, but benefits from these changes. And they can't do it, we can't come up with a plan and then go to the community and say, hey, here's the plan. It needs to happen while the process is going through. And so that's baked into the proposal. And so once we get those plans, we need to know how we're doing and actually achieving the goals in those plans. And so, like I said before, a lot of times you have a 10-year jump, right? So between 2030 and 2040, for example. Well, we don't want to get to 2040 and we're like, oh, wait, 2 years out, oh, we're not going to make it. So we need reporting in the meantime. So we need an interim report as we work towards these greenhouse gas emission reduction goals. And then we have our climate action plan. There's a lot of frustration in the advocacy community. I share that frustration and how weak that climate action plan was and how lack of creativity and ambition. I understand they were dealing with a set administration at the time and dealing with the governor that we have now. All of these factors, but at the same time, we got to think out of the box. We have a climate emergency. We need to act appropriately. And so we need to make sure that as technology changes, as administration changes, as policy changes, as infrastructure money comes in, we are updating that climate action plan to be current with the days that we are dealing with at that time. And so we are requiring every 5 years that that climate action plan be fully updated. I should note that that is DNREC's intent to update that, but I don't care about intent. I think a lot of folks that have dealt with DNREC don't really care about intent. We want it codified that that's a requirement. But it's not just DNREC, because you can't just fix every system and agency from the outside. We need the state agencies also at the table and coordinating with each other to make sure that they are doing everything they can to help combat the climate crisis, the climate emergency that we are in. And so we need the state agencies to do internal reviews of their planning, their regulations, their fiscal programs, their programs like DNREC's weatherization program, right? The programs they offer to the public. We need them to look inward and identify recommended actions to help ensure that we're changing regulations when needed. That if the state agency itself can't do it and the legislature needs to act, that they do it, or the governor needs to act, that he does it, or they do it. So we need the agencies to look inwards because they're going to know what the challenges that they're going to face are. Now we need that initial assessment pretty quickly. So there is a pretty big time crunch. It's a monumental undertaking. So we didn't just give them, 6 months or a year. We said, okay, 2 years, 2024, you need to have that initial assessment done. So that way we can start immediately taking those actions and changing those regulations, changing these processes to make sure that we're going to get to our 2030 goal. Last thing we want to do is set a goal and then we miss our first one right out of the gate. And so we need that inward dive done. The question then becomes for these state agencies, how often do you have them reporting out to the public, to the governor, to the legislature on their progress? Right now, I can tell you every state agency across the state, and this is a systemic issue that we need to solve, they're understaffed. They're under-resourced and understaffed. And so you're seeing already programs fall away. You're seeing work that needs to be done not being done. You're seeing money left on the table from grants not being utilized correctly or to their fullest potential. And so we can't continue down that road. We need to staff these agencies. We need to act like we are in the situation we're in, which again is why we need to declare the emergency outright. The question then becomes, do we want them to do a year of work and then a year of report development? Do we want them to do 2 years of work and a year of report? Because it takes about a year to do these reports. Or do we want 3 years and then a year to report? What's the correct number of years to take action to do what we need them to do versus spending staff time, because it's all the same people, to spend staff time developing a report? We need reports, but how often do we need them? That's one conversation we're having right now. And then we need to know the fiscal impacts, not just to the agencies, but to the state. What's the damage from the IDAs? What's the damage from the sunny day flooding to DelDOT, to the state? What's the damage from DHSS perspective to the state on Medicaid going up, right? We need to know the fiscal impacts of climate change to the state so we can make sure our budgets are ready, that we see the curves as they start to approach and we can benchmark appropriately. So we need that as well. The real reason that we need all of this planning and reporting, aside from the fact that we need to have a plan to get to what we need to do, is we need accountability. So the public needs to be able to see what's happening. Delaware has some of the best kept secrets of programs that are out there that nobody knows about, the work that's being done that nobody knows about, or it's not being done and people don't know it's even supposed to be being done. There's a huge lack of accountability and transparency. We can't have that as we move forward in a climate emergency, right? We need to have the accountability and the transparency baked into the system to make sure that we know what state agencies are doing or what they're not doing. We know what their goals are versus what they accomplished. We need that kind of transparency. But more to the point, the agencies, more than anybody else, are going to know their challenges around equity, around outreach, around fiscal costs, around what they need in terms of changing regs and processes internally and externally. An outside agency is not going to know, DNREC's not going to know everything that DelDOT needs, but DelDOT will. And so we need them at the table to make sure we're doing everything we can do to get to these goals. DNREC will never be able to do it by themselves. The other agencies, Department of Education needs to electrify their school buses. DelDOT needs to plan for climate, for flooding, for resiliency, sustainability, right? Department of Health and Social Services needs to take into account Medicaid's going to go up, right? So what do we need to do to help stem that tide? So we need the agencies at the table. So the last thing, of course, how can folks help? How can they get involved? So there's a QR code on the screen that will actually take you to an action where a letter writing tool where you can write an email to your state legislators, to the governor, and let them know that you want them to declare a climate emergency. You want them to create goals. You want them to act accordingly, plan and do reporting. The letter is written, but you can change it. We left it open so that you can change, you can delete it if you want, you write your own, you can amend, you can edit it, you can change it. However you want to treat that letter, it is yours to do as you wish. The biggest thing is we need a flood, because this is not something the legislators are talking about. I mean, we're doing lobbying right now and talking with key allies. Rep. Lambert will be hitting you up here soon, but we're doing as much outreach as we can in the groups that we have. But the people have to demand this change, because there's already, DNREC is already at the table, right? And we can maybe have an idea of how those conversations are going to go. If we don't have the support of the people, if the people are not saying we need 50% by 2030, we need accountability, we need transparency, then those things are on the chopping block. Whereas if we had the people, if we had a flood of hundreds of letters being sent to legislators, when those things come up on the chopping block, legislators are there and they can say, no, this is what my constituents are demanding that we do. This is what I'm going to vote for. Anything else, I'm going to stand against that change. So if we don't have that people power, we're going to be behind when it comes up for a vote, when it comes up for further discussion. And so the biggest thing is to spread this action as far and wide as possible, whether that's online, email, personal interactions, coming to events like this and doing it yourself, whatever that looks like for you. As many of those touch points as you can hit on, the better. So thank you very much for listening to me droll on about this project. Obviously have a lot of passion on this and happy to answer any questions, but thank you for the league for inviting us and hosting this for League Day.
Wow, that was really great, Dustin. And I'm just kind of blown away by the fact that all of these experts were able to communicate so beautifully. Dr. Fletcher and Mary and Dustin are all just incredibly well versed in their topics, and I so appreciated that they could talk in language that we could all understand. No snow jobs, they just really communicated, and I loved that, and I loved their passion. Charlie, why don't you take it from here?
Very good. Well, thanks to our speakers, but now we're going to have some questions from those of you who are interested in finding out more. put your questions in the chat area, if you would, please. I see already that Marge Johnson had a question. She says, I'm a little confused as to who is it that declares the climate emergency? Is it the governor, the legislature? Did the agencies have to sign on? What's the process? I have a feeling that's a question directed at Dustin, but others can chime in too. Dustin, you want to give that a shot?
Yeah, sure. So it looks different in different jurisdictions. Obviously, the state legislature did not declare it for the city of New York. In New York, Hawaii went through the state legislature. We are advocating that it goes through the state legislature because, again, it's what can you get in the Delaware code, in the statute, that's going to hang around. If the governor did it, the next governor can come in and undo that executive order. Doesn't mean that he couldn't do it. He can. It's all about staying power, though. So the legislature, in our view, is who needs to do it.
Very good. Would you say that laws can be revoked by the next legislature, but it's probably less likely that they would do so once the law gets enacted, signed into law by the governor, that's probably pretty permanent. Is that your thinking there?
Correct. Yeah, it is quite a process actually to get rid of a policy that has been implemented through state legislatures. Normally, it's altered somehow, but repealing a law is actually quite a process.
Very good. Well, here's another question. I think it's for you again, Dustin, but Peggy wants to know, when do we work on shoring up the salaries and increasing the staff in the departments? And how do we go about doing that?
Yeah, I'll take a first crack since I guess I brought the problem up. This is a monumental issue in our state government. We have, over the decades, shrunk our government down to what in any other state I think would be considered a very lean, kind of right-leaning government structure, in that you tend to see in Republican states much leaner government agencies, fewer staff doing the work, fewer programs being offered, and things being dished out to nonprofits or just not given at all. And you're seeing that, and have been seeing that, in Delaware for quite some time. So we have to get off of this idea that a lean government is the right way to go, particularly when we're facing such dire issues, such as the climate emergency that we are in. And so the conversation needs to happen from starting at the top, because it is happening under advisement from our current government. And so if you don't have the governor willing to increase the budgets for these state agencies, because he will not have anything happen that is not a one-time expenditure, well, then you're not going to get any staff, because those are not one-time expenditures. Those are ongoing expenditures, but they are expenditures that we need to have. Instead, what we're talking about is, oh, we're in a surplus, we have to cut taxes. Well, no, we don't need to cut taxes. We need to start offering the services and doing the work that the government should be doing, in my view. And so, others can debate that, but that's where the conversation needs to start. It needs to start with the budget, which starts more or less with the governor. Obviously, the legislature writes the budget, but if you look at the proposed budget by the governor versus the budget that the legislature puts out, well, there's not usually a whole lot of difference. So hopefully that answers the question.
Thank you, Dustin. There's a question, looks like it's headed towards Mary. Tiffany asked, could we access or view the legislation which you mentioned has been submitted to the Delaware legislature so far? Is that something that is available?
That's an interesting question. I don't see why not, because as Dustin said, we are seeking support for it. And so folks need to know what's in it. I'm not quite sure logistically what the best way to do that would be. We have a fact sheet that sort of outlines the highlights of what we've submitted and what we're looking for in terms of the planning process and reporting. Let's see, ideas from others who've been working on that. Dustin, do you have an idea about the best way to do this? I
guess I have a little bit of a different take. So one of the challenges that has happened in the past is that we had multiple drafts floating around on a bill. And then legislators got confused when lobbyists started talking to them as what draft they're referring to. Because there's often, substantial changes, not necessarily substantive, but formatting changes, even one word being changed can make a pretty substantial impact. Often it's the impact that you wanted it to have originally. Hopefully, normally this early in the process, you don't get anything kind of being gutted or anything, but things get tightened up, they get reformatted, they look better. And if you have older versions floating around, your lobbying efforts become very difficult very quickly. And so I'd be a little hesitant to share actually the working draft, knowing that as conversations continue to move forward and a bill actually gets filed, formatting wise is going to look differently. Some wording may change, even if the impact stays the same, because we have all you beautiful people fighting with us.
Very good. Would you say that it's in draft condition still now before it goes out to a bigger audience?
Yeah, so I probably would be hesitant to share anything beyond necessarily the fact sheet. I would be more than happy if folks would like to go through it together to show interested parties what the draft looks like. I would be just hesitant in sharing, say, like a PDF version of it, and then something changes, and then we get the confusion that we had with the renewable portfolio standard increases actually when it happened last.
Well, if I could chime in, Dustin's PowerPoint was a really good summary of what the practical points are in the bill that we're seeking. And actually, my whereas part of it is, I don't think particularly controversial, or it's probably less subject to change. So, maybe that also is reflected in my PowerPoint. So in a way, you've kind of seen the essence of what we put in front of the legislature, just without the technical language.
Very good. Thank you, Mary. If I may, I'll ask a question of Dr. Fletcher, since he hasn't had a chance yet to respond to other questions I see here in the chat area. Dr. Fletcher, it seems to me that we've talked a lot about building public will or public support for these concepts, and your perspective, your testimony, if you will, is powerful stuff. Are you planning on talking to others in medical associations or departments to build that public support amongst the medical community?
That's exactly my perceived lane, at least for myself, is lecturing to the hospital systems. I'm actually the vice chair of the Department of Family Medicine for Bay Health. So that's an angle that I'm taking for all of us frontline primary care doctors, because we are the ones caring for the asthma, the cardiovascular disease, the cancers. And if we could dovetail reduced morbidity, mortality, and use language that should affect or pull at the heartstrings of everyone, I could imagine most people wanting their kids to have less asthma and other pediatric diseases if we're just intentional with these legislative changes. So information, I think, is the real currency that I'll be spending over the next couple of years. And it will be talking to doctors, to church communities, to schools, doing continual medical education opportunities. Because believe it or not, my master's degree is in the harms of pesticide in these small communities. So I just thought it was pretty neat to use something that got me to where I am to make a difference for my 1-year-old son. And I think Dustin's got a soon to be 1-year-old. So there's some selfish gain in there too. And when I look back at my own story, I realized, my goodness, I'm one of the people in this population I'm trying to save, who didn't have a basement because the water level was high, who had reactive airway disease, not so much as something intrinsically wrong with me, but I just lived in a bad air environment. So I think that is a long answer to your simple question. But yes, I think information and talking from a real and personal perspective is useful.
Speaking of you or your answer, talking about reaching out to other groups, so church groups and others to spread the message that you put forth here tonight, Peggy was wondering, how do you think is the best way to engage with underserved communities? Dr.
I
Fletcher?
think that if I may jump on that one first, and anyone else can of course answer after, it's just meet them where they are. I recently did have a talk with my local church, and then we're going to build on that idea in terms of a big family day where instead of just an interested cohort, will now be hopefully the whole congregation. And if I can build from there, then it could be 3 or 4 churches next summer. Because again, when you periscope in or you zoom in, you're able to see that there are some clear disparities. And people may say, oh, the environment doesn't affect me. Well, it profoundly does in terms of disease burden.
So those of you who are on this call may want to invite Dr. Fletcher to come to speak to your church or your group, or in my case, I'll invite you to come to my Rotary Club and share your perspective as well. Thank you.
You got it.
Other questions here from the chat is there grant money available to subsidize the cost of residential solar energy? So asks Ron Lewis. Who wants to take that one?
Yeah, happy.
Dustin?
Yeah, happy to talk about that real quick. So yes, if you are a Delmarva customer, the answer is yes. So DEC and DMEC, the Delaware Electric Cooperative and the Delaware Municipal Electric Corporation are our other 2 utilities. The city of Dover actually now is our 4th utility. They have their own programs, which I'm a little bit less familiar with. I do believe that they do offer grants for residential solar, but I know for a fact that Delmarva does offer grants for residential solar. I'm in the midst of getting solar installed myself, so I'm getting pretty familiar with that process. Which has been a dream of mine since I was like a little kid, so it's super exciting to have it happen. But so Delmarva is actually working with DENREC to upgrade actually that grant. And so increasing the amount and taking away the headache of dealing with the solar renewable energy credit headache that a lot of folks don't really feel like dealing with, myself included. So you'll get more money in your grant and you won't have to deal with the SREC auctions, because Delmarva will just kind of administratively own those SRECs for giving you more money upfront for your solar, which I think most people would probably prefer. So DENREC is also creating a low income residential solar grant. So it'll be covering the cost 100% to install solar on a low income home and up to 75% for a moderate income home. And they're being fairly generous with the moderate income folks. So they're really trying to do what they can to ensure that as many folks can access rooftop solar. The question just becomes the roof. So part of the process for getting solar is to make sure your roof can handle the solar. And so if they can't, then they direct you into the weatherization assistance program to help you shore up your roof so you can then get the solar installed. So you get energy efficiency, you get a nice roof, and you get solar. So wins all around.
Lorraine Botticelli asks, why is there such opposition to electric school buses in Delaware? Seems like a perfectly wonderful thing to do. No more belching of nasty diesel fumes right on those kids in their school buses. Is it just money or is there something else? Justin, do you want to answer that one, or Mary?
I can jump on. If Mary wants to jump, she can. Okay. So the question is kind of threefold. So money, yeah, of course, is a big component, but we're finding out that we're getting a number of millions of dollars to convert school buses to electric. And so there is, I wish Ann Quizell was on the line. I would tell you to come if you can, come to the Sierra Club's Earth Day event and hear Ann talk about this exact issue at that event, but I'll give it a go. So there is conversations right now about electrifying school buses because the infrastructure bill had money to do so. The second part of the problem, aside from money, is infrastructure and the grid being able to charge electric school buses en masse. That's a lot of power happening relatively at the same time. And the districts or the state, needs to decide how they're going to pay for the substations and the infrastructure necessary. Can we use infrastructure money from the bill to do that? Does it have to come from the budget as a one-time expense? So those kind of conversations are, again, kind of happening right now. I wouldn't say there's necessarily opposition. It's just more the technical aspect of how a lot of districts contract out for their school buses and drivers. Maybe a little bit of ways to avoid costs of benefits, but also because it does tend to be a little bit cheaper for the district. So if the district doesn't own the buses and there's no companies doing all electric fleets of buses, then there's a change in dynamic. And so working through the process of how to change that dynamic. So I don't know if there's much, maybe opposition is the right word, more challenges.
Well, we're getting to the end of our hour, and I wondered if I might take the liberty of asking once again, Representative Larry Lambert is still with us, hanging in there. Thank you, Representative Lambert. Any thing that you learned here tonight that was new for you, or any questions that you might have had for the speakers or even for the whole audience?
Yeah, I learned so much. I really appreciate all of the speakers we have today, Mr. Fletcher, Mary, Dustin. And we're usually in contact via email. Mr. Fletcher, I'd love to get to know you better. But yeah, I just want to thank them again for their time, for their passion. And these details, this data is just jaw-dropping. It's truly incredible. So yeah, we'll definitely be in touch. I serve on the Natural Resources Committee in the House. I'm also chair of the Justice 40 Oversight Committee, which looks at making sure that at least 40% of investment benefits, federal investment benefits around climate change, green energy, pollution remediation go to our overburdened communities. So all of this data has been super helpful, and I look forward to being continuing to be a partner and seeing what we can do at the legislative level. Thanks, everyone.
You are indeed a terrific partner. We are so glad to have you on our side, doing the good things that you're doing. I want to be like you when I grow up, Well,
thanks, Charlie.
Sure. So let me say that we do want to thank everybody who's involved in putting on the show tonight. That's not only our speakers, Dr. Fletcher, Mary Douglas, and Dustin Thompson, but also the folks from League of Women Voters, Linda, Peggy, Marge, Tiffany, Marianne. You were all wonderful to help make things run as smoothly as we have done so. And it is now past 8:30. So thank you so much for hanging in there with us and learning so much tonight. Have a good evening. Thanks for coming. Bye-bye.